Do you live, eat, and sleep the hotel industry? Looking to brush up on your game? You've come to the right place. Welcome to No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast, with your host, Glenn Hausman.
Hey everybody, this is Glenn reporting for No Vacancy Podcast, and I want to thank you all for listening. This is a very special episode that I'm doing here because I wanted to speak to a couple of people that are really directly involved with what's happening in the Caribbean. We know about the hurricanes that have been happening, and there's a lot of issues going on with what's going to be happening there in the future. Is it still going to be a viable tourism opportunity? Is it still a smart place to invest your money? And I couldn't think of a better person to talk to than Mr. Parris Jordan, who's chairman of the Caribbean Hotel Investment Conference and Operations Summit, also called CHICOS, which is November 9th and 10th in Bermuda. Now, I've known Parris for a long time, and he's been very, very focused on this region, so I think he's going to be able to answer all of the questions that you guys have there. Parris, how are you today?
I'm great, Glenn. I would like to thank you. It's great to speak to you again. Thanks for the opportunity today. As you know, your outlet is great to get the word out, and we need to let people know what's taking place in the Caribbean and the impact of both Hurricane Irma and Maria on the islands and the recovery efforts.
Yes,
yes. So thanks again.
Yeah, my pleasure. We surely do. And unfortunately, to all you listening out there, we're going to have to keep this one kind of serious. I feel so much negativity is going on right now because of Mother Nature and other things that it's very difficult to try to produce a fun show with a lot of levity. But this is a serious issue, Parris. What exactly, from your perception, is happening right now in the Caribbean region as it relates to the big picture?
So obviously the two hurricanes that hit the islands has impacted the region tremendously. There were some islands that were severely impacted. There were some islands that were not impacted. And then there were some islands that were somewhat impacted. We're seeing a lot of damage to specific islands, and I will name a few, and I can go into greater detail as we go further into the podcast. But like Anguilla, Barbuda, Dominica, Puerto Rico, St. Martin, both on the front side and on the Dutch side, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Turks and Caicos, and St. Bart's. These destinations were all really, really severely impacted by the hurricane. And then you look at islands like Bahamas and Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Cuba, they were somewhat impacted. Not as impacted as the islands I mentioned prior, but they too had serious damage to their islands. And, you know, there's 32 islands in Caribbean, and a lot of people tend to group the Caribbean as one, but there are many different islands. And as you know, there are some islands that were not impacted. So like Antigua, Bermuda, Cayman Islands, St. Kitts, Jamaica, Aruba, Trinidad and Tobago, and Curacao. These islands were not impacted at all. Yes.
Okay. So unfortunately, you're right. I think people have a tendency to lump it all together. So when I talk about the Caribbean, obviously, from a tourism point of view, people will hear that some of these islands had damage. I don't think people are necessarily, unless you're really in the know, sophisticated enough to be able to immediately differentiate between places that were affected, places that weren't affected, and how that's going to just affect people deciding whether or not to even take a vacation to the Caribbean. So my concern is, even though places that suffered zero damage may still suffer deleterious financial effects because of this. Before we get into some of the specifics on the islands, do you see that as being as a real worry zone going forward?
Definitely. I'll give you a quick example.
Yeah.
So the destination of Bermuda, for example, was miles away from the hurricane. It was not impacted at all by none of the two hurricanes.
It's really hundreds of miles away from where most of the Caribbean islands that we commonly think of as the Caribbean are located, correct?
Exactly, correct. And what happened was they were encountering issues with people canceling stays in Bermuda. And as the tourism authority in Bermuda looked deeper, a lot of folks were confused in Bermuda with Barbuda. And as you know,
God.
Barbuda was struck.
Decimated.
They were decimated, yes, correct. And now Bermuda had to deal with cancellations and so forth, which obviously had nothing to do with the actual hurricane on their island. So yes, other islands have been impacted, and that's just one example that I wanted to share with you.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important example because it seems like we have a hard time differentiating what's going on within the news in terms of the Caribbean location. So I'm not surprised that the American public in particular would cancel trips to Bermuda when in an area that was not affected at all. So what is going to be happening? Where was the Caribbean market performing up until now? And how do you think overall it's going to be moving forward? And then we can get into more of the specifics.
Okay. So that's a good question. What we've seen over the last 5 to 6 years has been a market that has recovered quite strongly. As you know, the last downturn after the financial crisis, the market was impacted. The Caribbean region is highly reliant on the leisure customer.
Absolutely.
And when there exactly, and when there's a downturn, people tend to watch the dollars that they spend, and they cut back on leisure travel. Unlike the U.S., where hotels are supplemented with meetings in group and commercial demand, the Caribbean relies heavily on leisure.
Right.
So we saw the Caribbean take a dip in 2009, late 2008, following the last downturn. But there's been 5 to 6 years of very strong growth, both in terms of RevPAR and average rate growth, and even in terms of occupancy.
Right.
So from 2010 to 2015, the market produced 6 consecutive years of both average rate growth and RevPAR growth. In 2016, we saw a slight decline, marginal, just a couple points. Nothing to worry about, because what happened was the market had risen above its prior peak by 2014. So by that time, in 2016, we saw a slight softening. However, that trend was reversed earlier this year. So prior to the hurricanes,
right,
the market was again improving or increasing, although slightly, 1 percentage point, but again, it continued to increase. So we'll see how things shake out after the numbers are released following the hurricane. But, in a nutshell, the market has been pretty strong the last few years. Demand levels continue to increase on a consistent basis. One of the things that also helps the market is there are very few additions of new supply coming in, and operators became a lot more efficient. In the last downturn, they learned how to operate more efficiently, to cut their expenses, and to watch their bottom line. So the existing hotels were doing very, very well prior to the hurricanes hitting the region.
Yes, that makes a whole lot of sense to me. So then I'm really curious as to what you think the impact is going to be on a go-forward basis. And I think we have to split this into 2 different categories at this point, start to drill down a little bit. Markets that were severely impacted by the storms, and others that were not as impacted by the storms, but still may suffer the consequences of those storms hitting the general region. So maybe the natural place to start is, and I know you don't have a lot of information because it's still a developing story, about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's been in a challenging state for a number of years to begin with. I've spoken to Milton Segredo, who runs a CVB down there, about bringing more business down there repeatedly and the financial issues they have. It almost seems to me that this is just one more thing that they didn't need it, and they have a lot of trouble just getting their footing. What's your gut tell you what's happening now and where this market might be headed to in the future?
Puerto Rico is going to need a lot of help, especially in the rural areas. As you know, there's not a lot of information available, but my sources are telling me, because I've spoken with operators in the market, that a lot of the properties that operate in Condado and Isla Verde are running on generators. And a lot of these hotels are not taking new reservations, but they are housing like relief workers, aid workers, military personnel. So there is some demand there for those hotels. And a lot of the hotels had cosmetic damage. And to them, not a lot of structural damage, which is good news.
Yes.
But however, they're impacted. The real issue is really in the rural areas, right? And whether it's hospitality related or non-hospitality related, there's a lot of suffering that's taking place, and a lot of homes were damaged. A lot of workers don't have homes to go to. So that's really the main issue with Puerto Rico. And we also on the news the severe flooding and the damage to the buildings. So, my heart goes out to the folks there, and I hope with the president's visit this past week that the aid will get to the right people and the island, and hopefully this destination can recover. Puerto Rico has been a very resilient market. So, apart from being a leisure destination, they have a very high level of commercial demand, far more commercial demand than any other Caribbean island. So it's been a market that has done very well.
And it's terrific. And it's sort of a convention center that's down there, and a great little development around it with lots of hotels and entertainment and restaurants.
Exactly. And they've done a great job marketing the destination the last few years. And again, to your point with the convention center. So there's various types of demand that goes into Puerto Rico. So it's a great market. But right now, Puerto Rico is hurting, as we all know, and hopefully they can get out of this in a very good way soon.
It's interesting that you bring up the point about the relief workers filling those rooms, which helps with demand in some sense and helps, but they usually pay a lower rate, for example, because they're negotiated rates. So, I guess that's a silver lining kind of a scenario. How long do you think that keeps up in that region and then some of the other islands before it goes away, and then they have more realistic challenges that they have to deal with?
Yeah, so and I'll speak to that point and another point you raised earlier, like some of the impacts and different islands as well. So that's a great short-term help for the specific island of Puerto Rico and other Caribbean islands. And what's going to happen is these workers stay there, even though, as you said, it's low rated, it does produce demand, and it allows the hotels to run profitably, efficiently. And as the hotels are repaired and so forth, then you can start taking the leisure customer. So at the end of the day, it does work out for the hotel itself. And then that demand is short term. And then once the hotel is repaired, we can then bring in more of the international travelers and leisure travelers. Now, touching on the impact to the entire region, I think in the short term, we will see some shifting in demand from one island to the next. In some cases, from the Caribbean maybe to other warm weather destinations, be it in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. But this will not be a long-term impact. We're already seeing markets like Jamaica, for example, that was not impacted by the storm. They're seeing a slight uptick in demand because, again, it was not impacted, right?
Right. And theoretically, if I'm going on a vacation to that part of the world and one area is no longer viable, then I might very well just say, oh, let me go to this other island that wasn't impacted.
Correct. And then again, it goes back to geography, as we mentioned earlier. Right? Do people educate themselves and they understand which hotels were which countries were impacted, which weren't, and so forth. So, for example, like Aruba and Curacao, right? These hotels are so far south, they're outside of the hurricane belt. Right. They rarely ever get impacted by hurricanes. So you're seeing people talking more about these destinations. In fact, I was in a call this week with a client, and he was encouraging an investor to look at Curacao, which has been a really great sleeper market for the last few years. But now that the hurricanes are hitting other destinations, they're like saying, "Hey, let's look at Curacao." Yeah. So you're seeing things like this happening, and some of the affected markets, while losing the leisure business, as I said earlier, they have this other form of demand, like the aid workers, military, which will help during the recovery period. I feel, though, that one negative impact that we will see, and this may become the new normal, is the cost of insurance is going to continue to increase. And Glenn, we saw this after the last tough hurricane season, that a lot of the insurance costs for different hotels throughout the islands increased. And as we all know, this has been a very difficult year. So unfortunately, I do think that we'll see that cost go up, and that's going to be a long-term impact for the region. On a bigger scale, hotels that operate in the Caribbean tend to be just as profitable or slightly less profitable than a similar hotel operating in the U.S.
That's interesting.
But the benefit of operating in the Caribbean is that your labor costs, for the most part, rooms expenses, and your real estate taxes tend to be less expensive than they are in the U.S. However, those costs are normally offset by higher insurance costs for the Caribbean and also higher utility costs. So now we're going to see insurance costs go up, and it may have an overall impact on the market, thereby slightly reducing the profitability of hotels operating in the region.
Right. So it's a lot to digest there. So what about the people on these islands? Because tourism is so critical to islands, especially the ones that were affected by it. What does that mean for employment and the continued viability of these countries to make a comeback and support their people through a robust tourism business?
Yeah, it's gonna be very, very challenging.
Right.
As you know, tourism is by far the most important economic sector for the Caribbean region. It generates annually $30 billion in economic activity for the entire region. Over 28 million travelers visit the Caribbean on an annual basis. Travel and tourism is the number one employer by far for the Caribbean region,
Right.
providing both direct jobs and indirect employment. And as you know, the Caribbean has limited natural resources. So the beauty of the islands was like a natural transition from plantation economies to travel and tourism. So to say that this region is reliant on tourism is an understatement. And with the challenges that the region is facing now, they tend to generate income from tourism. And now their tourism plans have been impacted. So how do you generate that additional income to get back to where you were? Having said all that, the region is very resilient. They've been hit by hurricanes in the past. It is part of the day-to-day living of folks there on island. It tends to hit in September and October every year.
Right.
So they've grown accustomed to it, and they have no other choice, Glenn.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Like in the Caribbean, most people that live in the Caribbean need visas to travel elsewhere, to leave the island.
Right.
In addition to that, it's expensive. So what do? They batten down the hatches and they try to ride out the hurricane. It's not like they can travel to the United States or to Europe. They got to deal with it, right? So they just fight, and they're very resilient people. They clean up after the hurricane. They work together. They help each other. But this year has been such a difficult year. They need help. They really, really need help moving forward.
Right. So what kind of help would you recommend, and how could we help?
Okay. So there are a few things that need to be done in order for the region to get back to where it actually was. The first thing that needs to be done is, and you're seeing this happening on some of the islands already, or most of the islands, where the most immediate need is actually taking care of the sick, getting water and food to folks on the island, helping some of the locals with their homes. A lot of homes were destroyed by the hurricane. There was a lot of damage, so homes need to be repaired. Debris needs to be removed from the streets. So in essence, you need to clean up the island. You actually need to take care of the residents and the people living on the islands and the workers that work in the hotels. And then once that is done, then we need to repair the properties, try to get the hotels back to the condition they were in. And not only hotels, but just general infrastructure, the airports, the roadways, the bridges, and so forth. So once we can get that done, we also then need to market the destination. And the Caribbean in general needs to do a better job marketing, and island destinations as well, and getting the word out, that, hey, we're back in business and we're ready to accept visitors, and the country is great and the hotels are great. And maybe getting travel agents to visit and actually witness that and so forth. I was speaking with Mark Durliat, who is the principal of Grace Bay Club in
Yep.
in Turks and Caicos, and he actually said that we as a region and Turks specific for him needs to get the word out, and they're doing a good job. Like they've done the cleanup effort. Now they're trying to get travel agents, to come down once the country's cleaned up better and the properties are all cleaned up. But it's getting the word out, marketing, having people see that they're back in business. And then that once the word spreads to the press and so forth, then, the market will recover, essentially.
Right. So I found all of this very interesting, especially the sense with the resilience of the people. And I think that all of us in general wind up being more resilient than we actually believe we will be. That's more of an existential kind of a thing. But it's great to see that they're all rallying and they're going to come back. And I hope that everybody does find success in the future. And I believe at the CHICOS conference, which is the Caribbean Hotel Investment Conference and Operations Summit, you're probably going to be focused a lot on the state of the industry now, the recovery that's happening, and why it might still be a smart investment for people to take part in the hospitality business in the Caribbean. Could you give me a sense of what's going to be discussed at the event? And then I'd love to hear you, plug it so people can go.
Oh, definitely. So our opening panel, we're going to have 5 global CEOs, including the CEO of Wyndham and Choice and Aimbridge.
Oh,
and
amazing.
other companies. Thanks. And obviously we had to shift gears, right? And we have a planning committee, and we had completed our program, and then these hurricanes hit. So now we've incorporated discussions on the hurricane and how do we build better? How do we recover? And how do we take it to the next level? It has to be sustainable at the end of the day. So throughout the conference, we're going to, there are going to be various lenders, there are going to be developers, there's going to be CEOs. And in addition to speaking on normal topics, we're going to include how do we rebuild, how do we recover, and so forth. So we're looking forward to that. And a lot of leaders are going to be there, and they're going to put in their 2 cents how we move forward as a people. And in terms of investment and going forward, again, the region being so resilient, it will come back. And at the end of the day, I have investors that are calling me today saying, hey, Parris, are there opportunities now to acquire properties possibly under market value, like we saw after like 9/11 or after the last downturn? And you know why they're calling with these questions? Mm-hmm. Because they too believe the market will come back. They know the market will return, and there's hope. But it's too early, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're a lender and a property is encountering issues, it's not that property specific, it's the market. Mm-hmm. So where there may be these opportunities in the short term or midterm, we're not seeing those opportunities today. So having said that, again, the Caribbean is a very popular destination. A lot of Americans visit, Europeans visit, and they will continue to visit. Once the countries recover, we expect the numbers to be strong again towards the end of the year and definitely next year. We just need to get through this recovery period.
Right, totally. And I could say firsthand that I really enjoy the CHICOS conference. I think I was at the first or second one at Atlantis, Bahamas. Was it? I think the first or second one. I don't remember.
Yes.
And I also believe it was when Obama was elected for the second term. It was right over there. I remember eating ribs and watching election returns at Atlantis, Bahamas. So that was...
Well, just to add quickly to that, you're correct. It was the first and second year. And then funny to that point, last year we were in Puerto Rico, and it's actually when Donald Trump won the election. We were having dinner just prior to the conference the night that he won. So apparently CHICOS is staged during the time of election.
Yes, I love that, and hopefully I won't have to wait another 3 years to come back. Unfortunately, I personally won't be at this event, but I highly recommend everyone to go there. I would be there myself, but I got my cousin's son getting married, so I'm not going to be able to attend. But I would have been there otherwise, and I highly suggest that each of you look into going to this conference. Go to chicos.hvsconferences.com to find it. Parris, any final words on the Caribbean market in general and on the event?
I'd like to put a plug in.
Please do.
the people of the region. We HVS CHICOS and the government of Bermuda has contributed some funds to the Rotary Foundation. Living in the Caribbean, being from the Caribbean, as you know, Glenn, I'm very passionate about the people, the country, tourism. My heart goes out to the different islands that have been impacted, the people that own hotels and operate hotels, and more importantly, the residents that live in these islands and the governments. And there's a long, difficult road ahead. But I believe strongly that the countries will bounce back and tourism will bounce back again, the resilience of the people and the fact that tourism is what is needed. It's their main economic sector. So it has to recover for the countries to rebound. We've contributed to the Rotary Club Foundation. If you were to Google Rotary Foundation 7020-7020, you will get to the website and you can peruse at your leisure. Encourage friends to donate. I know there are a lot of different charities out there. The reason I'm plugging the Rotary Foundation is because, I've lived in the Caribbean. I've experienced it. Last year, we were there on the ground. I saw how they operated in the Bahamas when the Bahamas was hit. Every dollar that you donate goes to the people that are in need. That, for me, is the number one selling point. And then secondly, they're in the top 10 list of charities in the world.
Wow.
It's comprised of professionals that give of their time, successful people that give of their time, and they're spread all over the Caribbean islands, and they're in the islands that were affected by the hurricane. And interviewing government officials and people in the past, they've recommended. So that's why I put the plug in for them. That's why we contributed funds as well. So I just wanted to say to your audience, if they could, and if they can contribute, hey, send a link to a friend.
Yes.
That's all that I ask.
And if you can't do that, take a vacation down there. And also that link that Parris mentioned is also at chicos.hvsconferences.com, right there, highlighted on the page. So you'll be able to find that. Parris, I want to thank you so much for being here, and I wish you guys down there the best of luck moving forward, and hopefully lots of future success, and when you emerge like a phoenix from the tourism flames.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Again, thanks for the opportunity. I'm happy to try to get the word out and, hope that the Caribbean can recover strongly and quickly. And again, thanks for your time.
Thank you. And we will be right back with another interview focused on what's going on in the Caribbean right after this break.
Have a question for your host, Glenn? Tweet him now at Traveling Glenn. No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast. We'll be right back.
Hey everybody, Glenn here. And if you're like me, then I know that you love terrific art. Art that creates a sense of place. Art that tells a story of where you are. Art that adds a level of detail that you can't get anywhere else. And great folks that do this, Kevin Barry Fine Art Associates. You can find them online at kevinbarryfineart.com, and I highly encourage that you check them out. One recent project that I'm totally in love with is the Fairmont, Washington, D.C., where they created a custom project with a local artist, and they created some of this on site. They actually created a multi-dimensional wall sculpture from gold blocks, which is an abstracted map grid of the Washington, D.C. area. It's got different elevations to it and looks absolutely fantastic. It was done along with Deborah Forrest and Amanda Jackson of Forrest Perkins, which is now Perkins Eastman. And they all work together to create this fabulous new look. So if you want to create a fabulous new look for your hotel, or if you just love great art, check out kevinbarryfineart.com or give him a call at 310-945-2655. Let him know Glenn sent you.
Back to the show. It's No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast with your host, Glenn Hausman.
Hey everybody, and welcome back. Right now, I've got Andrew Cohan. He's the managing director with Horwath HTL. What is in Miami? What does HTL stand for there, Andrew? I always wondered that.
Yeah, HTL is Hotel tourism, and leisure.
Oh, well, that makes a lot of sense. And today we're going to be talking a lot about hotels, tourism, and leisure as it affects the Caribbean region. As you know, in the first half of the show, we talked about the dire situation that parts of the Caribbean are in and how some of the areas of the Caribbean which were not affected by the storm are still being dragged down by people not understanding the differences between certain regions and other regions, even though they're hundreds and hundreds of miles apart, such as the example we talked about with Bermuda. So we're going to talk to Andrew today a little bit about what these areas can do to help improve their business prospects going forward, and then maybe a little bit about what you can do to support them as well. Andrew, thanks so much for being here with me today.
Oh, thank you, Glenn.
All right, so what's going to go on now in the future? I know it's pretty vague, but it doesn't seem good to me in the sense that if the average consumer who doesn't decide to look below the surface says, oh, the Caribbean's a mess, I'll just go to these other places. The Caribbean's already been under pressure, I feel, from other areas to vacation at. What now, and how can we make sure that there is a light focused on opportunity for the Caribbean tourist?
Well, as always, it's a matter of marketing and public relations and communications and education.
Right.
Americans aren't the greatest at geography, as you know. Our country is so big and large that unlike some smaller nations, we don't depend so much on knowing where our trading partners are. We just, know where we are.
Yes.
So it's, I saw actually an article this morning from the Turks and Caicos talking about how, and they were hit hard twice.
Yeah.
But I guess with their British construction codes, they fared very well.
Terrific.
They had quotes from several of the resort projects saying everybody's getting ready to open again and we'll be here for this season. And we have our airport is open, and things will be back to normal very quickly.
Good.
So
that's important. But the question I have then to you, sir, is how do we get Americans who are very stuck in a rut to actually start paying attention and to keep their eyes and ears open for great opportunities to come back and support that market?
Well, I think it depends on a little bit on the price level of the market. The traveling public, the mass market who goes to the all-inclusive resorts seems to respond really well to pricing and bargains. So that's one thing, is if they see a good option, they'll investigate a little further. If you remember, soon after September 11th, back in 2001, the public took a while to start traveling again.
Right.
And there were great travel bargains, and some of us said, hey, we'll take advantage of it. We love to travel. And, that got us traveling before others. So the dollar certainly makes a difference to the mass market. To the luxury market, it's just a matter of, well, these folks rely a little bit more on high-end travel agents than others, so they don't have to research it themselves. They have people who say, well, Moustique is fine or St. Lucia is great, and like that. But there's always some leftover effect. I mean, a few years ago when the drug violence was so high in Mexico, some people just wrote off Mexico. They didn't know that Cabo San Lucas was perfectly fine because it's at the end of a road. There's no trafficking because, nothing passes through there.
Not only that, but it's a great tourism destination. So the Mexican police were very sure that nothing would happen to damage that industry. And I'll tell you, what surprises me, Andrew, is that people even in the industry fell prey to that. I remember being part of an event that was taking place in Mexico at the height of all of that, and people weren't coming because they were fearful, yet they were in the know hospitality professionals. That makes me worry about trying to get that family market to return to places like Turks and Caicos, even when things are okay. I've got a great buddy who just did a vacation within the last 6 months at a premier resort. I think it was Beaches that's in Turks and Caicos. Had an amazing time, but is probably more reluctant to go back right now. So I think that the educational process is probably something that has to be focused on a lot at this point, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking of Cabo San Lucas, they were hit very heavily by the Hurricane Odile in 2014. Fortunately, there it was one of the good stories. We saw some of this in Miami as well after the big hurricane 25 years ago, where things change, things get sort of washed out, and a lot of new investment comes in.
Right.
Now, I'm not suggesting that what happened in some of these islands was a good thing, as we've seen so much misery. But for those that had fringe damage, there's a lot of insurance money that will come in, and places that were ripe for renovation will have that opportunity when they might not have otherwise. So, there is always in the recovery something new and different appears. I mean, Cabo in the last 2 years has had probably more luxury hotel investment than any Mexican market. And part of it is that everything got refreshed and new. So everybody wanted to keep up, right? And everybody wanted to say, "Oh, I've got to get in that market." And there's still 5 or 6 luxury developments under construction today.
Well, that's terrific, and I think the key words that you're making me think of is, number one, resilience. Is these jurisdictions and these countries are going to find ways to rebuild, find ways to make things better, no matter what they've been through. And the secondly, I think, is American short attention spans. I bet a year from now, people are going to not even remember a lot of what we're mired in right now within the news. Do you think that's a fair assessment on both counts?
I really do. I mean, we get bombarded with so much news that if it didn't happen yesterday, it's sort of old news already.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting and scary on one hand, but on the other hand, I think it's a great warning to or opportunity for our hoteliers to not get too depressed and worried, because we can only handle so much in this very insanely short news cycles. So hopefully, by the time winter rolls around, if you put in some of these marketing programs that you're suggesting, perhaps then we'll be in a situation that business will return, although not at the profit levels as previous.
Yes, and we continue to see good news of new investment in the region. It might not be in the center of the affected areas, but I just read this morning how the Palladium Company, a big all-inclusive company from Spain, is purchasing, renovating, expanding 2 big resorts around the Cancun area. So anything that expands development in the general region, that increases airlift to the region, is going to have good spillover effects for the whole Caribbean.
So I think that's the hardest part of it, is the airlift portion, right? Because airlines may be tempted to cut back, and that could leave hoteliers in a lurch. So hoteliers probably have to work closely with the airlines to kind of say, hey, this is what we have in store in terms of marketing and planning for the next 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you'll see winners and losers, because they'll shift traffic to where there is business.
Right.
But on the other hand, for instance, there was a local airline about to establish a new route from Tortola to Miami and from Tortola to New York this fall. And of course, British Virgin Islands was hit quite hard in the first hurricane, I believe. And so now are those plans going to come to fruition or not? These are things we'll have to see. But on the other hand, it gives an opportunity to sort of grow from a fresh start. They won't be, if a smaller island is fighting for increased airlift, they won't have to be pulling it away from a larger destination. There'll be sort of a fresh look at everything. And as well, I think this different cities and the community at large learns things every time we have an event like this. I know the big Hurricane Andrew in Miami, we found out that gas stations work off electricity.
Right.
And now every gas station in Florida has a generator. In the same way that we stockpile, petroleum in Texas or Louisiana as a nation, maybe the islands will have, in the name of resiliency, find ways to store the essential items that they need for events like this, and that hotels and resorts do the same, that their guests might not just be stranded for a day or two, it might be a week or two. And how do you deal with that?
Right. And beyond that, say all of these island nations do what they need to do in order to recapture the imagination of the international traveler. What about the idea of, will there be enough labor then for all of these hotels? I hear stories in Puerto Rico how people are just going to, depart the island en masse. Although, as a guy that lived in New York City, I would have thought so. They'd already done that with the amount of Puerto Rican folks already in New York. But all joking aside, can some of these smaller items, when you see islands, when you have younger folks that are stuck with the idea of, hey, do I stay here or emigrate to another country in order to find my way? What do you think is going to happen with that and its effect overall on being able to service the tourism industry?
Right. Well, we see these movements of people. We've seen it in New Orleans, for example. A lot of people who left due to the storm were low-income folks who got a new start in Atlanta or in Dallas and ended up not coming back. Mm-hmm. In the same vein, many construction workers came in from Texas and from around the South, and there never was much of a Hispanic population in New Orleans, except these people came and there was building for 10 years. So they settled their families there. So the whole immigration flow, if you will, even though it was domestic in our case, mm-hmm. could happen in the Caribbean. And certainly there will be people who respond to calls for labor. A lot of the restrictions on migration within the Caribbean were because there were such a limited number of jobs. They didn't want people from other island nations coming in and right. taking those. If you have a population of 80,000, 20 or 30,000 of those people are working, and right. that's a fragile employment base. However, if you're Puerto Rico and you need to rebuild an island, even if it's 3 million people eventually instead of 3.5 million because of the people who left, that's quite a lot of construction jobs. And I don't think they'll be that upset if people from, other islands come to take those jobs and help rebuild. Usually the ones who are leaving because they have other opportunities elsewhere, like you said, in New York and Orlando, Florida, and there are large pockets of places where over the last 10 years especially, Puerto Ricans have come and resettled just because of the lack of jobs. And it may be that, what started the economic troubles in Puerto Rico is when the incentives for the pharmaceutical industry went away. Right. And the high-end jobs just disappeared overnight. So, maybe some creative incentives like that, once there is the infrastructure, to support jobs there, once we get past the basic survival needs, there will be, hopefully a relaxation on letting in enough labor to rebuild and incenting mainland companies eventually to move back to Puerto Rico and give the remaining population a jump start at opportunity. Right. The same way possibly forgiving the debt that has been talked about as well.
All right. So it sounds to me that a lot of these problems that we're talking about seem to figure themselves out with just practical solutions and a little common sense thinking.
I think you're right. I mean, the New Orleans education system was one of the worst mm-hmm. before the hurricane, and they've made great strides since then. So
I think then the overarching point of this conversation is that no matter how dark things can get, there is always something positive that can be achieved out of them. And if we all throw our support in just a little bit, maybe instead of taking a vacation in one place, you decide to do it in the Caribbean, that'll go a long way to bringing back that market, the self-confidence of the people within that market, and their ability to feed themselves. So one question that I have for you, my last big question for you today, is we teased a little bit at the beginning of this with marketing programs, but is it just good enough to say, hey, come here and get 20% off to Puerto Rico or Jamaica or wherever you're talking about? Or can marketing professionals utilize a smarter strategy?
Well, I think the marketing, we never like to undercut or underestimate what the marketing folks can do.
Of course.
But something like, come to the Dominican Republic this year and have a discount on Puerto Rico next year would be a nice brotherly thing for the islands to do, doubling up like that.
Right.
Because some places just aren't ready yet, but we know they will be. They don't give up. People don't give up on their homeland.
No, they certainly don't, and that again goes back into the resiliency thing. So, okay, then how would you wrap all of this up, and then give us a good shameless plug for what you do?
I would wrap it up by saying my last vacation, I was just in September, and I went halfway around the world to Bali, and while it was lovely, I realized that the Caribbean is just such a jewel in my backyard. I live in Miami, and I didn't see any water or sand the color of the Caribbean. And while the service was wonderful, the culture wasn't any richer than what's right there. So I'm just a big fan of the resource that we have close to home in the Caribbean. And my piece of it is I work with hotels, especially new projects, to help design the right size for the market demand and that kind of thing. So we'll be all over the Caribbean as it starts its recovery and eventually has the latest and greatest resorts coming its way.
Yes, and you could, of course, find Andrew on the web at www.horwathhtl.com or A. Cohan, that's Cohan, so ACOHAN at horwathhtl.com. And I'd like to end off by saying how much I love the Caribbean. And I think you really struck a nerve with me there, Andrew, because we travel around the world and we don't realize what a jewel the Caribbean absolutely is. I love it. I think I should take my family there more on vacation. I think I'm going to reconsider other places I might have been to. I went to Hawaii a couple of years ago. Again, Hawaii is one of the most magical places on earth. Don't get me wrong, but the water is more gorgeous and warmer than in Hawaii. And it's a great place. Those great sandy beaches are a great place to lie around. And with the majority of the U.S. population living within, a 3-4 hour flight of the Caribbean, it's a perfect way to spend your vacation. So don't fly halfway around the world. Go to the Caribbean, show them your love, make things happen. Would you add anything else to that, Andrew?
I think you've said it perfectly. Thanks, Glenn.
Great. And I want to thank all of you guys for listening on our special report on what's happening in the Caribbean. And we'll be back with a regular show on Friday. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to No Vacancy, the hospitality industry's #1 podcast with your host, Glenn Hausman, online at rouse.media, on Twitter at Traveling Glenn, and on Facebook.com/Glenn.Hausman. We'll catch you next time.